Seen a new government policy and thought to yourself, I don't remember voting for this? Well, it's not just you. These days, governments seem to be getting their orders from either corporate lobbyists or unaccountable and unelected international organizations, not from their citizens. The United Nations appears to be one of the most influential of these organizations, and it recently released a plan for a, quote, global digital compact that governments will soon agree to. So today I'm going to summarize these digitization plans, tell you exactly when governments could agree to implement them, when they're supposed to be finalized, and what you can do to stop them. The report I'll be summarizing today is titled, quote, A Global Digital Compact, an open, free and secure digital future for all, an admittedly pretty innocuous title. It was published by the United Nations, or UN, in May this year after almost 4 years of work. I'll leave a link to the full document in the description if you're interested. What's noteworthy is that it was apparently put together by UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. Now, if you watched our video about the World Economic Forum, or WEF's, Davos meeting earlier this year, you'll recall that we summarized a speech that Antonio gave there. To refresh your memory, Antonio confirmed that the WEF and its affiliates have been forcing the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, using the Environmental, Social and Governance, or ESG, investment trend. In other words, the WEF is effectively the private sector arm of the UN. Now, the good news is that the private sector isn't too keen to play ball with the UN these days, as per Antonio's admission. The bad news is that the public sector is still very much on board, and Antonio instructed the politicians at the WEF to ignore the opinions of their populations when implementing the UN's policies. Seriously, watch that video if you haven't already, after you've watched this one, of course. Now, the fact that the public sector is still on board means that some of the UN's policies could still be implemented. If you want a sense of what these policies will look like, consider that the UN recently took over the EU's pandemic passport to develop what is essentially going to be a global digital ID. More about digital ID in the description. I digress. The continued influence of the UN in the public sector is why it's prudent to summarize its recent report. It's necessary to know what they're planning and when they want to implement it if you want to sidestep or even stop it. So, without further ado, let's dig in. The report begins with a brief introduction, apparently written by Antonio himself. In the first few sentences, he reveals that the proposals in this report are expected to be approved and adopted by global governments at the Summit of the Future in September 2024. Mark your calendars. Antonio also reveals that he is the one behind the broader UN initiative that this report is related to. We find that very hard to believe given the detail and scope of these initiatives and reports. It's more than likely that Antonio is being advised by someone, and it's possible he's not writing these reports at all. Anyway, speculation aside, Antonio underscores the fact that all the policies in this report are intended to help achieve the UN's SDGs. For context, the SDGs are a set of 17 milestones that every country is supposed to meet by 2030. The SDGs appear to be the origin of things like digital IDs, CBDCs, and that 2030 date you see everywhere. Antonio goes on to explain that these policies can only be achieved with the help of so-called stakeholders, a word that effectively refers to the world's most powerful individuals and institutions. Note that private sector stakeholders want profits and public sector stakeholders want control. This is why both parties are obsessed with digitization. Plugging everyone into the system increases profits and makes it easier to control them. Antonio laments the fact that some people aren't as plugged in as others and seems to imply that this is the reason why inequality is growing around the world. Some would say that the real reason inequality is growing is because central banks and governments are lining their pockets and the pockets of their cronies using money that's been printed or taken from the average person via taxation. But that's a topic for another time. Antonio also laments the fact that new and innovative technologies such as AI and crypto are not being sufficiently governed, that is, controlled. He seems to applaud the digitization that resulted from the pandemic and seems to imply that this is the direction the world should go in. Antonio ends the introduction by saying that a, quote, global digital compact is necessary to, quote, achieve the governance required for a sustainable digital future. By now, you'll know that governance means control, and you'll also notice that Antonio threw the word sustainable in there out of nowhere. This could be a subtle reference to the individual carbon credit score system the UN is trying to set up. More about that in the description. Now, the first part of the report is about what's required for global digital cooperation. Antonio, or whoever wrote this, explains that it requires having a set of shared goals. Lo and behold, the SDGs are literally highlighted in blue. Antonio then stresses that we must fully digitize the remaining 2.7 billion people ASAP. Incredibly, he seems to acknowledge that not everyone wants to be a part of this system. He says that a, quote, demand pull is also needed, and that this is where the public sector can play a role. He explains that they can do this by making things like digital ID mandatory to access public health services. Antonio includes, quote, schools and cultural services in this list, which begs the question of whether you'll eventually need to show a digital ID to get an education or practice your religion. Knowing Antonio, the answer is probably yes. At least this digital prison will be sustainable, renewable, green, etc. Jokes aside, Antonio calls on both the public and private sector to make all their data accessible so that the UN can keep track of how close countries are to meeting the SDGs. He admits that the UN has had a hard time assessing whether countries have achieved 41% of the SDGs in accordance with the 2030 date. He then pivots to a topic that he's been passionate about on Twitter lately, and that is online safety, aka censorship. He says that, quote, open, safe and secure use of the internet is slipping away from us, potentially permanently. Obviously, he blames this on disinformation, hate speech and the like. He acknowledges that some countries have taken steps to censor the internet, something that we've also covered in another video, but says that this isn't enough. He says that governments need to get more involved, both online and in the real world, and that they should crack down on hate speech. He also says that the, quote, global nature and infrastructure of the internet needs to be protected. This is reminiscent of something Antonio said in his speech at the WEF, and that's that he fears that the internet is splitting in two, a censored internet in the West and a censored internet in the East. Regarding AI, meanwhile, Antonio says that the rapid advancement of technology is making governance, aka control, very hard for the UN and its affiliates, and that AI has put this on full display. Naturally, Antonio is upset that AI is making it possible to generate so much content. Imagine the disinformation, he says. To his credit, Antonio acknowledges that AI can be beneficial, but only if it is sufficiently controlled. He reveals that the UN has already been working with AI experts to assess how it can be controlled and how to make sure that it can always be shut down. Probably needed if it ever starts telling the truth. And last but not least, Antonio says that the, quote, arc of innovation needs to be bent towards solving societal problems and global challenges. Translation, AI needs to be used to manage the peasants. He basically says that governments need to be involved because businesses won't do this on their behalf. Some would say that some businesses are doing the bidding of UN-controlled governments already, but let's not go there. Now, the second part of the report is about that global digital compact Antonio is so obsessed with. He starts by saying that digitization should be addressed in a manner similar to the climate crisis. This is quite concerning, as it implies lots of regulation, intervention, and restriction of the internet. It would be crazy if they swapped out the climate crisis with some sort of AI-driven digitization crisis, but that would never happen, would it? Speculation aside, Antonio explains that the Global Digital Compact he envisions adheres to the UN's SDGs, and the purpose of the compact would be to ensure that the SDGs are met. He hints that this will require, quote, new governance arrangements. In other words, more shadowy organizations. Yay! Antonio then lists the objectives of the Global Digital Compact and the actions that stakeholders should take to ensure these objectives are met. The first objective is to plug everyone into the matrix, and Antonio provides a long list of actions, including subsidies and $100 billion of funding to this end. This ties into the second objective, and that's to invest heavily in digitization and to, quote, develop environmental sustainability by design and globally harmonized digital sustainability standards and safeguards to protect the planet. A word salad that sounds like total control of digital technologies. The actions Antonio recommends include money, and more money. They also include sharing data so that the UN can finally start tracking how far along countries are in meeting the SDGs. For reference, there's only 7 years left. It's safe to say that it's not looking good. Maybe they'll just rebrand, like last time. More about the Millennium Development Goals using the link in the description. Moving on. Now, the third objective is to end the, quote, gender digital divide and to ensure that labour rights are adhered to online. Like all fuzzy-sounding objectives, the actions required to meet them include some seriously dystopian stuff, including the creation of a dedicated UN government body in every country. Watch out for those. The fourth objective is to ensure the internet remains open, secure, and shared. The actions Antonio prescribed include avoiding internet shutdowns to, say, manage dissent or opposition. What's funny is that Antonio suggests that governments use, quote, targeted measures instead. This relates to the fifth objective, which is to address disinformation, hate speech, and the like, to develop, quote, trust labels and certification schemes, and to ensure that gender is included as a part of every digital policy to ensure absolute equality. Antonio proposes a long list of actions here, the most important of which is to establish a global code of conduct to ensure that the internet is policed properly in every corner of the planet. After all, if there's some place where free speech still exists, opposition to the UN and its allies could start to spread. Can't have that, can we? Anyhow, the sixth objective is to ensure adequate data governance, i.e. control. Actions include ensuring that all data is interoperable, because nothing says privacy like sharing your most sensitive data with every corporation, government, and organization on the face of the earth. The seventh objective is to ensure adequate control of AI. Actions include, quote, urgently launching a global body that will regulate all of the AI in existence and any new AI that emerges. Antonio must have mentioned the UN half a dozen times in this section. Sounds like they bought into the AI boom. Now, the final objective is to ensure all the other objectives are met in accordance with the UN's SDGs. Now, we couldn't help but notice that Antonio used I rather than we when recommending what action stakeholders should take to ensure these objectives are met. It might be the first time we've seen this in any report by any organization. Some would say it speaks to the size of Antonio's ego. In any case, in the next part of the report, Antonio discusses the actual implementation of the Global Digital Compact. He starts by saying that different stakeholders will be responsible for different tasks, which is a no-brainer. He then provides a long list of UN entities that will assist with implementation. Oddly enough, Antonio doesn't believe that all of these existing UN entities are enough. He reveals that he wants to establish an annual digital cooperation forum after all the world's governments agree to the Global Digital Compact at the Summit of the Future in September 2024. What's hilarious is that he doesn't even ask for feedback about this idea. He literally says that he's just going to go ahead and start planning the agenda for this new forum. Would-be members of the forum already have homework. Every year, they're going to write a big report about digitization for the UN. Antonio concludes the report by recounting how the UN began this digitization initiative 4 years ago, and how he released an initial roadmap for it 2 years ago. A partial timeline can be seen here. Note that it doesn't end with that event in 2024. It ends instead with the World Summit on the Information Society Review in 2025. Antonio then declares that, quote, "The time for talking about the need for digital cooperation has long passed. We need to focus on how we make this a reality. We need to act now and with speed if we are to recover the potential of digital technologies for the equitable and sustainable development that is slipping away from us and the planetary crisis that confronts us. Quick, throw your freedoms away." On that note, we couldn't help but notice that Antonio refers to countries as states, presumably in the global government structure the UN is apparently trying to create. Antonio reveals that the UN is already actively discussing digitization with these states, so they are presumably on board. The remainder of the document provides a list of all the different UN entities and stakeholders involved in this particular initiative. An infographic of the key players can be seen here. I can't say I recognize any of them, but something tells me that the rabbit hole runs right to the center of the earth with each one. So this brings me to the big question, and that's what you can do to stop this global digital compact. Well, this is a bit of a trick question because it hasn't even started. The answer could be as simple as letting history run its course, or as complex as trying to convince public institutions to steer clear of it. The simple answer is to reference all the countless UN initiatives that never came to pass. As you can imagine, coordinating hundreds of institutions and tens of thousands of individuals isn't easy. Everyone must be on the same page, or else international goals don't get met. In case you haven't noticed, the world is pretty fragmented right now, and that's why Antonio is so frustrated. Internationally, the global south is slowly cutting itself off from the global north. Domestically, political tensions are rising fast, and UN-affiliated ideologies are quickly becoming unpopular. In this climate, it's impossible to achieve widespread consensus. The fact that some of the UN's initiatives are bad for the average person makes the presence of countries not conforming to a consensus a problem. That's because the average person will be able to compare outcomes and see what effects the UN has. And if we end up getting some kind of financial crisis, then it's guaranteed that neither the UN's Global Digital Compact nor the SDGs will add up to a hill of beans. Consider that the 2008 financial crisis stopped the SDGs dead in their tracks, and they were also on year 8 of a 15-year journey. It would be spooky if history repeated itself this year. But, for the sake of entertainment, let's assume that the UN somehow gets all of its ducks in a row. In this case, trying to convince public institutions to defect from its digitization agenda will be extremely difficult. That's because the UN can pressure them to comply using other public and private institutions. Not only that, but some of the UN's digital initiatives, such as CBDCs, may initially appear appealing to the average person. This means that there's likely to be lots of voluntary adoption at the outset. It's not until later that the populace will realize that they've sleepwalked into digital slavery. As such, the only solution would be to create an alternative system or help an existing alternative system grow. It just so happens that this is what the UN fears the most, especially when this alternative system consists of rapidly evolving technologies such as AI and cryptocurrency. Indeed, the fact that the UN fears these kinds of technologies is proof that they are a part of the solution. If the UN gets its way, though, it could become a part of the problem, too. Thankfully, technology moves much faster than the United Nations and is also much humbler than the UN's head honcho, so it's very unlikely. Let's just hope this doesn't result in a different kind of digital dystopia. And that's all for today's video. If you learned something new, let me know.